Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Gathuko, Africa Speaks. Crystal, I thank you so much for the opportunity to just share what I've been learning about discoverability and African books. As Crystal said, I have lived in Uganda full-time for 14 years. It has become my full-time home. And I know it will be my full-time home for the rest of my life. I came as a missionary, and so God has surely called me into this field. So I just thank all of you for the opportunity to present. And it's such an interesting thing that for ASROCO, we are presenting the issues, because normally I'm a person that likes to present the solutions, not the issues. And so it has been an interesting learning curve for me to say, okay, what are the statistics? What do we know? What are the challenges? What are the issues? So that we can come to a solution together. So you'll notice that most of this paper, we're going to present more of issues rather than solutions, so that we can start thinking through these things, so that we can start digesting them and come up with a long-term solution for them. And so tonight we'll kind of look at a bit of the history when it comes to African publishing, both pre and post. I won't go too in depth. Some of the things, it's just to kind of give us a basis for starting off. Then I'll look at some of our discoverability statistics, as well as initiatives that will help us improve discoverability in the long run, challenges, and people that I've been seeing that are starting to bridge the divide here on this continent already. And then we'll continue from there as Africa Speaks guides us. So the first part of this presentation will be more on the history. And what I have noticed when it comes to the research of what have we been publishing long-term over the years on this continent, most of the books that were published pre-independence were written by non-Africans about Africa. A lot of them were published either in the US or in the UK, and they were by missionaries or visitors that came to this land, learned our stories, told our stories, or kind of gave their own perspectives. It was written by a Western perspective about South Africa, the crime of the Congo in the early 1900s. All these books were written by outsider perspectives. However, there's a few pre-independent African authors that did make it through. That would be in the late 1700s, 1789, a book which I've read and find quite interesting is The Life of Oyolidayo Equiano. It's also known as The African, and it's written by a Nigerian author who ended up publishing his book in the UK when he gained his independence and his freedom. Another book by a Tunisian author came out in the mid-1800s, around 1857, called An Arab Merchant in Sudan. And that was also authored by a Tunisian, however, published in the US. Then we have another author. You may know her. Her name is Olive. And she published around 13 books. She's a South African author around the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And her first book that she authored was called Story of an African Farm. And that book was published in London. She kind of went in between London and South Africa as a writer and in her profession. And so she actually is one of the biggest publishing authors we have pre-independence, who was a local. She's a white South African, but she did publish 13 books. And then we have one, it was called West African Folktales, written in early 1900s, 1917. It was authored by a missionary in West Africa. However, it was published in Africa, in Lagos. It's the only book of the pre-independence era that I could find that was actually printed and published on the continent and not published from outside of the continent. So I found that very interesting, that as early as the 1917s, we were having some publishing coming out of Lagos, and they had that capacity to be publishing in that way. One of our greatest, I'd say probably greatest authors that we have, Achibi, said, if you don't like someone's story, write your own. And so there's been a lot of talk about we don't like the stories that some of these Western writers have been telling about Africa. They're either not accurate, they portray us in a strange light. And so once independence came, we started seeing now Africans starting to take the reins of African publishing and African authorship. And so the first 5 that I saw in the post-independence African publishing, many of them came out of Nigeria. Actually, the first 4 out of 5 books came out of Nigeria, and 1 came out of Zambia in the late 1950s to very early 1960s. And the most popular and the first that I think most of us know is Things Fall Apart. Now, one thing I found very interesting about this collection of books is that all of them are published by a single publisher. What happened was Achibi wanted to publish a book. So in the late 1950s, he decides that he's going to handwrite his manuscript of Things Fall Apart. So he handwrites a manuscript for this book. But he couldn't find someone in Nigeria to type it. So he looked for a typewriting service, found one in London, and sent off his only handwritten script to London, care of the post that he found, and sent it off and didn't hear anything back. But thankfully, people he was working with, someone was traveling to London. And so he asked this co-worker of his, when you go there, I sent something to a typewriting service. Can you try and follow up and find out what happened to the book? Did they type it? So this colleague of his goes to London, tracks down this typewriting service, finds his manuscript buried under a stack of papers on a desk. It had not been typed, and caused a big scene and said, I need this manuscript typed. And he sent in, I think, £22 to have this book typed. And so after that prompting, this typewriting service types the book, sends it to his colleague who was in London, and he started sending it around to different traditional publishing houses to see if he could find someone that would publish. And so he lands on this company called Heinemann Publishing, and Heinemann Publishing picks it up and says, okay, we'll print 2,000 copies of this book, and we'll take you in as our first African author under our traditional publishing house, and we'll see how it goes. And so they sell 2,000, and they keep selling and they keep selling, and it becomes a hit. And so from there, they start what is known as the African Writers Series. And all these books that we started seeing post-independence were all coming out of the African Writers Series. All the ones you see here, Zambia Shall Be Free, Burning Grass, People of the City, all of them are published under the same imprint. In total, the company published 359 books, all by African authors, 203 unique authors in total from 31 different African nations. The top country that they published was Nigeria. They published 34 different Nigerian authors. Second in line was South Africa at 28 authors, and Ghana came in third with 18 authors. But these guys, they're kind of the ones when it comes to discoverability and global discoverability. This publishing company is what puts most of these 31 African nations in terms of book writing and publishing on the map when it comes to global books. Some of the other countries that gained visibility through them were Zimbabwe, they had 12 authors from Zimbabwe, 12 from Kenya, 8 from Malawi, 7 from Egypt, 7 from Uganda, 6 from Cameroon, 6 from Senegal, 5 from Zambia, 4 from Sierra Leone, 3 from Sudan, 3 from Ethiopia, 3 from Mozambique. Oh, and I'll let you know some of these books were not all published in English, so they weren't insisting that these need to be Americanized stories. Some of the books that they were publishing them in local languages. And it's told that they weren't editing the content much. They would take on these authors and say, tell us your unique story. And they weren't over editing like some of the other traditional publishers were. So they were a unique presence in the history of African writing. Additional 3 authors were from Cote d'Ivoire, 2 from Namibia, 2 from Angola, 2 from Congo. The list kind of goes on. Gabon, Tanzania, South Sudan, Lesotho, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Morocco, Somalia, Mali, Gambia, Mauritius, and Madagascar. Those were the 31 countries that were all gaining visibility and discoverability by one publishing house that was based in the UK. And they weren't, what the amazing thing was, is they would find African authors that were actually catching popularity, and they would encourage them to write multiple books under the imprint. So we had Kenya, there's the author Theongo. He wrote 11 books under this publishing house. Achibi, he wrote 9. Bessie Head wrote 8. Cyprian Ekwanzi wrote 7. So these were authors that were becoming multi-book publishers with the support of a traditional publishing house. But once the first book came out and they noticed that there was a readership and an interest in the stories that these guys were telling, they would encourage them to keep writing. And so somebody that went from a handwritten note paper of, I'm going to mail this to, I don't know who it is, but a typewriter service in London, and pray someone sees this script, went from a handwritten paper to having 9 books globally published. And actually, Achibi is the only African author who is on the 150 best-selling list of all times for the globe. And so they made Africa kind of get on the map when it comes to global discoverability. That kind of leads me a bit into some of the statistics I found. As I mentioned, Things Fall Apart is the only African book on the best time seller list. This is not the US New York best time seller list. This is the list for all time book publishing. There's 150 books on it, and there's 150 series on it. And so in terms of African content, Things Fall Apart is the only book on that list so far, selling 20 million copies, which they know of. And it was traditionally published by AWS. Then we have some of our other books. We have Half of a Yellow Sun, we have Purple Hibiscus, we have books like Chintu. These are books that we've all come to know and love. But the very interesting thing is that all these books that some of us have gotten so familiar with and they've become iconic in the African sector, they're all traditionally published. We have very few books that are self-published and actually getting the discoverability that traditional books and Africa Writers Series ever got. And so it's something to think about, especially because in Africa, most of us are focusing on self-publishing rather than traditional publishing. Yet what the statistics are pointing at is that we need to reconsider some of the means that we are publishing, because we're not starting off on the same foot and with the same power behind us as some of these larger publishing houses are doing. And that's where some of our discoverability where we're seeing some of the discoverability issues. There are some exceptions, and I looked for global exceptions. So when we look at that 150 top booksellers in the world, there are 4 self-published books that made it there. Some made it into the series, but these books in particular, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, The Martian, The Shadow, 50 Shades of Grey, these are books that were actually self-published, and some of them are still self-published today, to this day. Some sold their rights as they started selling their books and getting out there and becoming more visible. But it's to say that it's not impossible that self-publishers can become globally visible. However, according to the statistics, it's not as likely. There's no African book that has been self-published that is actually on this list, although there are Christian books that are on that list. A publishing coach out of the US, Tiffany Hawk, said that traditional publishing offers authors access to extensive distribution channels, including brick-and-mortar stores, airports, book displays, online platforms, and libraries, while on the other hand, self-published authors are relying primarily on online platforms, small consignments with local bookshops, print on demand, or their own personal social media pages or websites to push their content. This is one of the challenges that we're seeing when it comes to discoverability, is that the power of a single author is not as strong as the power of a traditionally published author. And so some of the hurdles that we're seeing is the upfront costs, the advances or lack thereof. For global statistics, this is based on global statistics and not just African-based, but a traditionally published author is not paying any upfront costs. They're not paying marketing and distribution costs. They are only gathering advances and royalties. And most of the books that are traditionally published are earning about, on average, $3,400 per book per year. And so they are getting the power of their traditionally published housing, their publishers' housing, what is it called? Their publishers' strength of the publishing house, taking up all the costs, taking the risks, and being able to then push the strength of their name through their imprint and through their sales. And this is what's making the traditionally published authors more visible and more discoverable than the self-published authors. For self-published authors, they're spending on average $2,000 to $4,000 to develop their books. That's on average basis. They're not, of course, getting any upfront advances, but they're earning smaller annual royalties per year to pay back those costs of their book developments, and they're taking on the marketing and distribution responsibilities themselves. And so by the time an author has gone through that process of creating the book, editing, paying for its print, all of these things, they've reached their book launch and they think they're done, but they've only just started. But a lot of them are looking at, I just need to sell my original books so that I can make up my costs, and they haven't allowed for any kind of costings to cover marketing and distribution. And this is one of the things that is hurting their visibility and their discoverability, because they simply can't afford the costs to actually get their book into mainstream media and to get it sold. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Africa is made up almost entirely of self-published authors. There are some exceptions, especially in the area of curriculum and in textbooks, but for most, we have very small publishing houses that are helping self-publishers. Some of them may be hybrid publishers, but the traditional publishers are definitely fewer and far between. and they are kind of going out of style when it comes to the common publishing that we're doing nowadays on this continent. So that's the different types of publishing. When we look at statistics based on secular versus Christian publishing, the statistics get even more interesting. When it comes to the statistics for book sales, and of course I'm linking book sales with the fact that books have to be discoverable to be sold. So you're not going to buy books that you can't find, that you can't discover. So books that are being sold annually, when it comes to religious content, about 179 million books, religious books sold every year. However, that's including every religion, whether it be Muslim, whether it be Asian religions, or whether they even, I think, include atheism in there. So when you look at the statistics, the global statistics of religion, about 12% of that slice would be considered Christian text, minus Bibles. We're not counting Bibles in the Christian text because Bibles, we're kind of putting it more into the reference. But annually, about 20 million Bibles are being sold, and about 19 million Christian books are being sold. These are not Bibles. They're Christian content, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. But when you look at the annual book sales over all genres, the Christian books only account for 2.4% of all sales. So already when we're talking about discoverability and we're talking about are African secular writers more discoverable than African Christian writers, it's not very fair of a context to compare and say African secular writers are more discoverable. By essence, the Christian publishing is a very small wedge globally. So when you look at global sales, secular writers are outselling all Christian writers in all countries around the world. So it's not fair to say it's only a common problem in Africa where our Christian writers are not getting as much visibility as our secular writers. It's actually a global issue and not an African issue. So that's one thing that I really wanted to point out. One thing I looked at from Jeremy Borna, he's a Christian publisher with HarperCollins. He was talking about the issues of Christian books and how they're sold. And he said that the majority of Christian books are sold through Christian bookstores and not online from independent authors. So my thought was, why? And when I delved into it further, it's because most Christian readers want an assurance that the Christian book that they're buying is doctrinally sound. And so they believe that they're not going to go find an independent author or an unknown publisher to get a Christian book, especially a Christian nonfiction book. They're going to look for a publisher that they know their doctrine and are assured of that they're going to get solid advice, or they're going to look for a well-named, big-name Christian preacher or Christian personality that they know and trust their doctrine. And so when it comes to nonfiction Christian content, the majority of books that are being sold are either by big name authors or big name publishers, and the majority of the sales of those books are actually still coming out of known bookstores and not so much online and with independent authors. One thing that was interesting, though, is that Christian readers, when they studied, they still lean towards fictional genres more than non-fictional genres. So when they look at the Christian book sales, they're seeing Christian romance books, Christian suspense books and Christian sci-fi books are selling more than Christian nonfiction books. And so that's something to keep in the back of our mind as we are publishing, and see how is that affecting what we are doing as African Christian authors. We are, as African Christian authors, we are facing significant challenges in access to these distribution channels because most of us, as mentioned previously, are self-published, so we don't have access into some of these mainstream distribution lines, and so we are not getting the backing of the large named Christian authors or the large name Christian publishers that some of these other Christian authors are getting, which is significantly limiting the potential for book sales and for global exposure to Christian readership, because 9 out of 10 readers are going to pick up a book by Rick Warren because they know him and they know his doctrine and they know what he stands for, versus an unnamed pastor that's in Kenya somewhere that they've never heard of before because they don't know what's his doctrine. Is it sound? Can I trust it? And so 9 out of 10 times they're going to pick an author that they know based on what they have experienced in their circles. When we look at the Barna Research Group, some of the book trends when it comes to African Christian books is that they asked readers, how many of you buy any book, whether it be non-Christian, whether it be Christian, how many of you buy a book in one given year, one book? And about 70% of adults and about 75% of teenagers said, yeah, we buy one book every year. But when they asked them more narrowly, how many of you buy a Christian book, one Christian book in a given year, the statistics dropped significantly. Adults, about 34% are buying at least one Christian book a year, and teenagers, slightly under that at about 32%, are buying one Christian book. But what I found even more interesting is they asked this same group of people, how many of you read a Christian book in any given year, one Christian book? And these same people are reading more Christian books than they're actually buying the Christian books. Factors for this could include that they're reading maybe through their church libraries, they're being given books rather than paying for books, but also the gifting of Christian literature. That happens a lot. So you might find that somebody is buying a book for someone else as a gift. But especially on our continent, we have a lot of piracy of Christian books because a lot of our Christian readers think that because it's Christian content, it should be free because the Bible is mostly free. So they pirate Christian books versus buying Christian books. And so that's something that is affecting the book trends globally, not just on our continent, but worldwide it is happening. We are finding people reading more Christian books than actually buying them. Now, one thing I found interesting as I went back to our 150 all-time bestsellers is that there are very few Christian books that are actually on that list. These were the ones that I could find. So out of 300 books, 150 individual books and 150 series, we only have 4 that are Christian, meaning all the bestsellers in the world, only 1.3% are actually Christian authors. And of that, only 1 is non-fiction, the one by Rick Warren, which goes into those statistics that we saw that Christian readers are preferring to purchase books by known pastors or known publishers. His is the only book that is actually classified as Christian literature of all the books on the best time seller list. And he has sold 33 million copies of The Purpose-Driven Life. When it comes to The Shack, The Shack is classified only as a novel. It's not classified as a Christian novel, although it teaches Christian themes, but it is a fictional novel, and it's rooted in that genre of suspense that we saw a lot of Christian readers want to read. Then when it comes to our series, our Best Times series, they classify the Chronicles of Narnia as a fantasy novel series. And so that goes into the sci-fi genre that Christian readers are looking for, as well as the Left Behind series, which is classified as apocalyptic fiction. But that's also, they also sometimes classify it as sci-fi or, you know, fantasy, something like that. But 3 out of the 4 are fictional, and only 1 is nonfiction. And these are our best sellers of African books globally. When we look at the African book market and we cross over, 1% of all global publishing revenue is coming out of African writing. And so if we thought that the 2.4% was small, we actually have less than that when it comes to African authors. We are only 1%. So 1% is African and 2.4% is Christian. When it came to Kenyan author Stanley Gazimba, he made a statement in an article that he wrote about the decline of African publishing and distribution. And he said that he can attribute the decline of African publishing as a result, or, you know, linked to the decline of the Hyman African Writers series, because the African Writers series was actually the biggest publishing arm of African content globally. And they had their heights between the 1950s to the 1970s to the mid-1980s until they started to decline in the 1980s. And they handed over the African Writers series into the hands of some local entrepreneurs in Africa to continue running that series on their own. And when they did that, there was a bit of a recession in what was actually being published out of Africa. One thing that he mentioned, that Stanley mentioned, was that the new generation of entrepreneurs that the African Writers series was handed to focused more on safeguarding their individual interest within their limited territories or their national boundaries, rather than nurturing a cross-cultural, tough, and cross-border network that Hyman had actually established. So what Hyman had done systematically was erase the boundaries between us and start saying, let's look at African publishing on a whole. Let's work together. That's why they had 31 different countries represented in their series. But when it was handed over, these countries started saying, no, let's focus just on our country. Let's focus on Uganda, or let's focus on our publishing house, and let's forget about the others. And so when we stopped working together as Africa, we actually started to decline rather than improve. Oh, yes, I've shared this. Sorry, I didn't show that slide before. But yes, the nurturing, what Stanley was saying is that we need the nurturing of we need to nurture the crucial cross-tough and cross-border networks that Hyman had established. Now, when we look at another study by UNESCO, done in partnership with the International Publishers Association in Nigeria, it was done in 2015. Despite the dire statistics that Africa only consists of 1% of global revenue, we are actually starting to experience an upward trend of growth when it comes to book writing. And so they estimated our annual growth rate at 6.5%. However, they did say that 50% of all the books that are originating out of Africa at that time, which was 2015, were all originating from 4 countries. South Africa being the first and the most, Egypt being the second, Nigeria being the third, and Kenya being the fourth. And so they were saying the rest of those countries were not even on the map when it came to, being pointed out of how well they're doing at sending their books out cross borders. One thing that I find very interesting, a statistic was done by the New Publishing Standard, and I find that it is especially true now post-COVID than it was even pre-COVID, is that most of Africa is split when it comes to the format of books that we are now consuming. 47% of African readers are looking towards print books, where 53% are looking towards digital books. Very few, although despite what many of us think, very few are actually accessing audiobooks. Those that are, they are more like the audio Bibles in the local languages, those cassettes that are handed out for distributing the gospel. But when it comes to actually purchasing content and books, our continent is actually quite middle of the road when it comes to, are we reading digital? Are we reading print? And so these are things we also need to consider. Are we making our books discoverable to all the different formats that people want to read? Are we making them discoverable to digital readers and print readers? The other thing that was implied in the last few slides, but not brought out fully, is the fact that in Africa, the most popularly read genre is fiction. And the most popularly read Christian genre, what I mentioned previously, are Christian romance, sci-fi, and suspense, all fiction. However, on our continent, most African Christian writers are not writing those genres. Most are writing nonfiction. They are focusing on Christian living content. They are focusing on self-help, motivational, pastoral teachings, biographies, and Christian history. But yet, if we want our content to be discoverable, we need to be writing in genres that people are actually looking for content for. So it's like making a product in a factory that no one wants to buy. If we want our gospel message to go out as African Christian writers, we need to find a way to put it into the genres that readers are actually looking for to buy and want to buy. That's what makes us more discoverable. Another thing that makes us more discoverable is by encouraging our writers to price books in a way that entices readers to buy. The BBC recently did a report, and the topic of the report was that in Uganda, books cost the equivalent of 1 month's salary. And I've actually seen it, because when I go into some of the bookstores, our books are very highly priced, mainly, and I think all across our continent, because of the cost of importing paper and the cost of printing. So when they did a global research, the average cost of our books here on this continent is $15 per book, whereas the global average is $10. However, when we look at what people are buying, most people are looking for ebooks that are below $4 and looking for books that are below about $9.50 or $9. So we have a disparity in how we are actually marketing our books to readers, but also how we are selling them. And it's most likely because most of our authors on this continent are self-published, and so they're trying to get back their investments quicker by selling their books more expensively without realizing that they're actually hurting their marketplace and realizing that it's hurting their discoverability. Because when you go and you find a book that you want to read, but it's priced at $25, most people say, never mind, I'm not going to read it. So these are things that are affecting our books and our discoverability. We do have a lot of people that are trying to bring initiatives to improve discoverability on the content. Things like literary festivals conferences and expos. We're seeing annual book festivals in Botswana, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Cairo. We have a lot of conferences and expos every year. Some of them are week-long conferences, some of them are one-day conferences. And these are things that are kind of helping us in visibility within those nations, but also on the continent. We also have people who are bringing initiatives like book awards and author recognition programs. We have the Kaino Prize for African Writing. We have the South Africa Literary Awards. We have in Kenya the African Christian Authors Book Awards. In Uganda, we have the Vine Awards, which is looking at book. It's just one book award, but it's looking at the best book with the best impact in 1 year. So these are things that are improving discoverability. We also have publishing degrees and scholarship funds that are starting to pop up around the continent. We have the Kwame Nkrumah University in Ghana, which now is offering a publishing studies program. We have the University of Pretoria. We also have a university in Johannesburg that are all starting to offer publishing studies programs, which are the first of their kind. But we also have a few scholarships that are starting to pop up for authors within the continent that can submit their writing prompts or their writing manuscripts and get funding to either help them self-publish, hybrid publish, or traditionally publish. We have digital sale platforms that are trying to help the discoverability of books. These platforms are showing books on their platforms, but then they are shipping their products. So people can buy their books online, but they have to be within the shipping ranges of those books. Those are things like the African Books Collective, Jumia, CLC Kenya, Mahiri Books. All of them are based on majority print distribution sold online. And then we also have ebook platforms and audiobook digital distributions that are starting to pop up, such as the one that I started, africanbooks.com. Those ones are still very few and far between when it comes to self-publishing ebook platforms that are working within the continent. There are some in Nigeria. However, the ones in Nigeria are mainly restricted to Nigerian readers and to Nigerian authors, just because of the movement of payments in and out of Nigeria. Some of the ebook platforms have been restricted with how global or how big they can be. And so we are starting to see improvements. We are starting to see growth and innovation in this area to help the discoverability of the books. And all of these things are taking place. One thing that we do need to consider is what a successful book looks like. Being that we have so many self-publishing authors, the quality of the content that is coming out of Africa, it's not necessarily that people don't want to buy African books, but the quality that they're getting when they're buying those books is a bit subpar. And so we need to consider, how are we going to improve the quality of the books that we are actually producing as a continent, so that global readers who expect a certain standard when it comes to cover design, when it comes to genre, the way the genre is written and priced, when it comes to how the book is edited and formatted, and when it comes to how the book is promoted and marketed, what quality and substance are we offering the world as African Christian writers? Are we actually putting something out there that people will read? Or are we publishing things that maybe our friends and family will buy because they love us and they want to support us, but the second it gets into mainstream purchasing, no one wants to buy it because it's not competing at the same level as some of the international books? Some of what I've seen as a publisher in Uganda, and I know some other publishers also seeing it, is that the characteristics of successful authors They are committed to the quality and standards of their books. Whether they be traditionally published or self-published, they are investing in their books. They're investing their time, they're investing their efforts, they're investing their money into making their product great. When we talk about successful authors, especially in self-publishing, they say that a successful author could be anyone that sells over 3,000 copies or more of their book. So these are the characteristics that they possess. They are consistent and captivating when it comes to how they market. They make sure that they are ongoing and intentional. They don't just put their book on a website and set it and forget it, but they're actually doing something about their book daily. And also those that are successful, especially in the self-publishing realm, they have large networks. They are able to bridge borders. They have networks that go beyond their community, and they are able to actually make an impact globally. Now, when it comes to the biblical perspective on discoverability, I find that discoverability is all about access. Proverbs, I think, gives us very beautiful insight into what access and discoverability looks like from a publisher's perspective and from an author's perspective. Proverbs 22:29 says, "Do you see a man diligent and skillful in his business? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men." Proverbs 18 says, "A man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men." When I studied these verses, the word business is work. And so authors, our work is to craft great books. So are we diligent and skillful in crafting great books? And if we are, the promise is that we'll stand before kings and we'll stand before great men. When you look at the word great men in Proverbs 18, it's actually not talking about just a few men. It's talking about a multitude. It's talking about a great number in intensity and importance. So if we want our books to actually gain a large audience and to be able to be discovered, the cause of making room for us is widening our borders, enlarging our space, enlarging our tents, so that we can produce work and books and content that is desired globally. That, I think, is our goal as authors and as publishers on the Christian content. What are some challenges? I think most of us know them. Some of the challenges that are hindering our current discoverability and our distribution are plagiarism, piracy, and copyright infringement. Some of the larger traditional publishers and the networks that they are part of, especially the distribution networks, they don't want to take African content because they fear that we've put something in there and we've plagiarized, or we have not we've not abided by copyright rules, and therefore they are a bit hesitant to put our books in their distribution models. So that's hindering our discoverability among large libraries and among book lists and book statistics. So what can we do to bridge those gaps and to ensure that what we're putting out there is actually our own legal work? On africanbooks.com, I've already had several books that were actually copied from other notable books. A Ugandan author uploaded 6 books and put his own cover on it, put his own first chapter on it, and the other chapters didn't belong to him. So of course we couldn't publish their books, but it's happening a lot here, and that's what's making some of the international networks hesitant at actually helping us promote our content. Other things that are hindering us, the lack of intercontinental collaboration and networks, as we mentioned earlier, limited access to distribution networks globally, and insufficient funding for large-scale publishing and distribution infrastructure. There is, however, someone I personally know that I can give an example for This is an African Christian author out of Kenya who has actually started bridging the divide when it comes to getting African content globally distributed. He's a pastor of a church in Kenya called Mavuno Church. And he started with a discipleship content called Mizizi. And it's a 10-week discipleship program that he did with the 10 churches he has here across Africa. And he partnered with a church in the US and gave them the ability to write a US version. And so that book was taken and rewritten with his insight and his approval and turned into the Rooted program. Now, Rooted has actually gone across most of the US. I think the last time they were talking about 50,000 copies or something like that, but I know it's more now. It's been translated into English, Spanish, Mandarin, and German at this point, and it's still being distributed church by church by church. So it's not impossible. This is an African Christian author who self-published this book and is actually making it in the global visibility of things. And his book is going far and it's impacting churches. There's so many testimonies about it. So I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I am saying it takes a lot of work to get to where he has come. And I know that it's possible with God. So just in summary, some few takeaways. Most of these I've discussed already. But one, there's a disconnect between Christian writers and their readers. Secular publishing is outselling 10 to 1 when we look at secular versus Christian. And it's mainly because our Christian writers are ignoring the reading trends, they're ignoring the popular genres, and they're not writing what readers want to buy. So this is something that we need to think about. And we need to think about, as African Christian writers, how are we going to write content that resonates with our readers? 2, discoverability linked to publishing type. It's very, very obvious in all the statistics that traditional international publishers are dedicated to showcasing, promoting, marketing, and distributing stories. And if we can get those types of publishers on our networks or in our networks, and we can push African-based stories and get the power of a Christian publishing house that has a global distribution with us, then we have the opportunity to actually overcome some of the self-publishing challenges that we are facing. Right now, 9 out of 10 renowned authors are traditionally published and they are making it because they're backed by collective efforts. So what are our collective efforts as African Christian writers? And lastly, large-scale systems and structures. How are we going to work together to build a unified model that will enhance, impact, and reach broader audiences, and to overcome some of the challenges we are currently seeing? So those are things for you to think about. I know I've presented a lot of issues, but I know that with the presentation of issues, there's a lot of brilliant minds here that will be able to come up with solutions to these problems so that discoverability and the lack thereof for African Christian content becomes a thing of the past. And so with that, I want to leave you with that and open the floor to any member reactions, questions, anything that you might want to say.